Well, the poetry of persuasion really came about because I'm in love with language. And I started thinking about how my experience with language, my experience as a poet, has not only shaped me, but shaped the way I create my work and my way of being in the world. And I think that at its core, any kind of language is trying to move someone. It's trying to get them to go from here to here, whether it's feeling, action, emotion, anything like that. The poetry of persuasion is part philosophy, part memoir, part expose. And it's really about my love affair with language and how I look at the world as a poet, how I see relationships, how I see businesses, how I see the conversations that we're having with ourselves, with others. And it's really about poetry itself, which is the best language in the best order, and how we are each the poets of our own lives. I think the poetry of persuasion is a book for people to expand themselves, especially the idea of the creative edge, which I've been kind of playing with for the past few months. Because sometimes we'd like to describe ourselves as not creative, or I'm not really a poetry person. And I don't believe either of those things about people. And I think that I wrote this book, and what I want this book to be in the world is a way of looking at where are the places where I'm the most creative, and how do I articulate that? And what about my life and the way I want my life to be is compelling and moving? And I think the poetry of persuasion is really about that. I still own my first poetry book, which I ordered through the Scholastic Book Club in 4th grade. And, there was no Amazon then, right? So you had to pick your books from a catalog, and then you had to wait like 3 weeks for the books to get to you. And my first book of poetry was called Street Corner Dreamin'. That roots it firmly in the 70s. And I just remember loving the words and the rhythm and the way that a poem could help you be right in the moment. And I loved the fact that poetry was rooted in the body and in biology. When it was really coming to in its oral form, a long time ago. Iambic pentameter, for example, it's the measure of a human breath and the heartbeat. So bump, 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 and then inhale of breath, exhale of breath. And I loved that. I loved that it was rooted in the body, and that it was part of who we are as human beings, not something special or something to just be, studied in a program or ivory tower. I think what happens when you read a really good poem, or you experiencing a good poem, is that there are pieces, words, images, phrases that linger. I've always admired Bruce Weigel's work. He was first dubbed a Vietnam poet because as a young man, he was drafted and went to fight in Vietnam, and when he came back, he used the GI Bill to go to school. And his language is utterly fearless. It always has been. And the first time I learned about his work was when I read the poem The Impossible, which is a really disturbing poem on one level because it's about an incident of sexual abuse, but it has this beautiful language. And the language in there is sort of describing what's happening in a way that you're sort of standing back from it thinking, okay, wow, is this what it is? And the very end of it is what's so compelling, because he says, say it clearly and you make it beautiful no matter what. And I think that, before and after I heard those lines, and they were memorable to me, they have been governing, my work, my life, my creative life, because the notion of saying it clearly is important for poets, because we are trying to give clarity, to gain clarity. I also think that saying it clearly is important in really significant relationships. Saying it clearly is important at work. And we struggle with saying things clearly. So sometimes it isn't even beautiful. But when we work to try to be in the moment and say it clearly, it will be beautiful no matter what. I think so many times when I am sharing a poem in my work or in my speaking, people will come up to me afterwards and say, I'm not really a poetry person, but I really like that, or can I have a copy of that poem? And that's always a great compliment to me, for sure, because I always wanted regular people, ordinary, normal, everyday people to like my work and to be moved by my work. And I think what happens sometimes is that for all the good that can happen in schools with poetry, and I was a teacher for a long time, there's also bad stuff that happens in the academy with poetry that makes it hard and inaccessible and challenging. And I don't know why so many people have had the experience of not learning to love poetry. I don't know why that is. I think there's some kind of secret club about making it mysterious or something. And so we learn that young, and then we say, oh, that poetry stuff, that was hard, it had to rhyme and didn't make any sense, and so people have these negative experiences. So I think if you're inclined or interested or even just intrigued by poetry at this point, there are a couple of ways to learn about it or to experience. I do think the spoken word tradition is something that allows accessibility to people, because people memorize and then perform their poems. There are poetry slams and poetry events. And so sometimes you can experience it as an oral art form, which is where it began. And that's a great way to get interested and experience it. I also think that there are so many ways to read poetry now. You can read it online, and you can have books, but finding a poem or two that an author that you like, a poet that you like, people who are accessible, that's easy to do too. So some contemporary poets. And then some of the classics. Some poetry is hard. Some things about life are hard. And so poetry just mirrors that. But I believe there's a poem for everyone. Well, I love David Whyte's work. I think that one of the reasons why he's inspired me, as a poet and as a person who has worked with businesses also, is that he's completely courageous about just going out there with poetry, and he publishes his own work, and he just doesn't take no for an answer, in terms of the idea that more poetry should be out there in the hands of more people. And one of his poems that I really love is the poem Sweet Darkness. And it really is about those times in your life where it could be any time. It could be, a transition that you're making from, one time to the next. It could be, my niece is just graduating and going off to school next year. It could be middle age or turning 40 or, whatever. But it's this time in your life where it seems pretty confusing. You're not sure what's going to happen next. You don't know which way to go. You wake up in the woods and you are in the dark and alone. And his poem Sweet Darkness is about the sweetness of that, the juxtaposition of that. And he also says in it 2 lines that I think are just brilliant, and ones that I use when I'm coaching people, when I'm talking to people. And he says, anything or anyone that does not bring you alive is too small for you. And I think that we need to be reminded of that, which is what poetry does. It reminds us of things, of truth, of being human, of struggling with the spirit and the human body, and all of those things. But anything or anyone that does not bring you alive is too small for you. Well, poetry in corporate America seems like it shouldn't be a very good marriage. I have joked around before about how, when I was in graduate school as an MFA student, we didn't hang out with the MBA students. We didn't go to the same cocktail parties. We didn't talk about the same things. There was an article published by Dana Goya in The Atlantic, and the title was, Does Poetry Matter? And one of the things that he talked about that I thought was so important is that we need each other, artists and business people. And our aims are not necessarily different. And it's that same idea that you don't have a personal life and a business life. You have a life. You have a life, and everything is integrated. And this idea that we can fragment things into pieces, it just doesn't work. And I think that taking poetry into corporate America, in a place that has been especially devoted to, business as usual and high performing teams and multitasking and technology, to say, wait a minute, let's do something counterintuitive and use poetry to inspire, to move, to start a conversation, to help people be more in the moment, it's still a radical act. It's not normal or ordinary, although I think we're seeing a little bit more of it. And I think having a poet in your business or in the business setting actually can help with the places you need to go next. Poetry requires courage, and it requires humanity, and it requires specificity and a love of language. And if you think about those four elements and how we need those in our work lives, we need courage. We have to have courage to make the right decisions. We have to have courage to make the tough decisions. We have to have courage to say no to things. We have to have courage to say yes to something. That's what poets do. They're cultivating and capturing courage. I think the notion of humanity, poets are, they're just next in line to the mystics and the philosophers. And we're trying to capture and recapture and retell the human experience. And the human experience is being played out in the drama of the workplace every single day. So who we are and what we do and how we show up at work and all of those people are just taking part in our own little private Beowulf or Shakespearean drama. And the other thing is that, in my consulting work, when I have worked with clients, what I notice is that an element of specificity or the lack thereof, it causes them pain, distress, they lose money, and so poets who are looking for the specific word, the very clear detail, that practice is a practice that business people can cultivate and can grow and can work with. And finally, that notion of language. Language is this messy, interesting thing. And no matter how dependent we think we are on visual images or how seduced we are by technology, it is the language that we use with each other, with ourselves, in our marketing, in our communications, in our sales, in our resolving problems, in our looking at global issues. All of it is hinged around what language are we going to use, and why don't we choose beautiful language to describe what's happening in our world, in our business, in our lives.